Thank you for listening to Scandinavian Crimes Podcast. Be sure to check out the episode links and be part of our other social media platforms where you can leave a topic suggestion or even share some of your insights regarding the subject matter of the episode. We will always do our best to provide a well-researched episode, but sometimes due to limited access to information and translation issues, some information can be lost. It is therefore good to do your own research and get a deeper understanding of a case of your own interest. So with that all said, let us start today's episode.
Welcome to another episode of Scandinavian Crimes. My name is Devante, and say hello to my lovely co-host, Delila.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, so today is going to be very different. Usually we talk about case files specifically, and obviously we will return to that. But this is a more of a free-form episode. There will be a little sprinkle of facts with a little bit of opinion and discussion. Once again, these discussions and these kind of episodes are meant to inform you of current events, past events, in order for us to work together as a, beautiful collaborative world to prevent things from happening to you, your family, friends, all that stuff. So this is just one of those episodes where it's not about a case specifically, but just information, opinions, just to get the conversation going. All the links that we're going to be using in today's episode to kind of base our opinions off of will be in the episode link tree description. So just click on the link tree. You can click the links for all the sources. Read this information for yourself. Do not take our word for it because we are fallible. We are only human. And these are only our opinions, along with, some factual stuff. But all the factual stuff will be listed. So, just wanted to get that out the way. Any disclaimers you think we should mention? Oh, I'm just going to say it right now. Trigger warning, because a lot of this might be personal for some people in terms of the topic, the subject matter. Just in general, the data and maybe even our opinions may make you uncomfortable depending on where you stand on this spectrum we call life. So, our job is simply just to inform. We're giving our opinions because we're human and we have opinions, but our purpose is not to offend anybody, but mostly just to inform and kind of, do some critical thinking in terms of solutions that we can do and all that jazz. So that's another disclaimer, I guess I want to say. Anything else we should say, Delila, in terms of disclaimer?
So it might be a little bit harsh. I don't think those are very explicit, but just be ready if it triggers you as it triggers me. And I will promise not to swear this time, even though it's aggravating. I will try my best.
Alrighty then, so I guess we can just dive right into it. So I'll let Delila take the wheel for this first section. She's very passionate about this.
So in order to distinguish between the different types of sexual interest in children or under 18, I will just shortly explain the definitions of the types, because although some people who commit child sexual abuse are pedophiles, child sexual abuse offenders are not pedophiles unless they have a primary or exclusive sexual interest in prepubescent children, and some pedophiles do not molest children at all. Pedophilia is sexual attraction to prepubescent children under 11 years old. Hebephilia is sexual attraction to pubescent children between 10 to 14 years. Ebophilia is sexual interest in mid to late adolescents, generally age 15 to 19. And then we have pedohebephilia, which is sexual attraction to either or both the pedophilia and hebiophilia. And then the last one is teleonophilia, which is sexual attraction to adults. And to group these types of categorized pedophilia, we have non-pedophiles, who are people who have no sexual interest in children. We have non-preferential pedophiles, and those are people who have roughly equal sexual interest in children and adults. And then there's preferential pedophiles, which are people who have more interest in children than adults. So they are more interested in children. However, studies have shown that non-preferential pedophiles, which means those who have equal interest in children and adults, is not really a risk factor for sexual recidivism, which means that they have a tendency to have sexual act or keep doing the sexual act towards children, which is surprising because what we see today, it's like contradicting in a way. But that's how the modern research until today have shown. And however, these research is mostly based on male predators or male. There's not a lot of research done on women. So
one thing I do want to address now that we're kind of getting into this point of the introduction of this episode is that it is one of the biggest things that we've seen in the research, as well as what I'm pretty sure a lot of people have noticed in society as well, especially coming from men, because a lot of this research is more a study on men than it is women, is that we as men have fantasies of sleeping with older women, having sex with them, and in a modern day society, we are realizing it is very much wrong. It is also predatory behavior. And in conjunction with saying that, the reason a lot of this is becoming a lot more prevalent in terms of the realization in modern day society as well, is it has to do with actually the patriarchy. Women were not seen as equals. They were not seen as people in power. They were not seen as predatory. They were not seen as a threat, which obviously I will say more or less the last 20 years, but people will arguably say the more 10, 15, we have started to recognize women more as equals. And with that equality comes the ability to recognize when someone is able to participate in both good and bad behaviors that men can do as well. So a lot of female predators, a lot of women in general who are predators are severely underreported because of, like I mentioned before, social society acceptance of young men having sex with older women. And that age can range from even 10-year-old boys to boys who are like 15, 16, 17, who are technically not allowed to be sleeping with older people. But, you get the point. The whole idea is that we are starting to realize research is being done and recognizing that female predators exist. They have existed and they have been floating under the radar. And in recent times, we are finally kind of able to start bringing them into the light and realizing they display a lot of the same behaviors as male predators. They are still not reported at the same rate as male predators because, like I said, times are different. But we are becoming more and more aware of these actions. And because of that, we can prevent situations from happening to young boys. And hopefully we can unlearn these things to help, make a better society, raise our children better in a safer world. But I guess with all that being said, let's kind of transition to the actual discussion part. So, historically, pedophilia was acceptable. And why was pedophilia more acceptable back in the day, at least socially, in terms of their society, compared to why we're transitioning away from that? Why was it acceptable back then?
I would say, I think it's more about how people they didn't view age. They viewed more like when a child became an adult, basically. So when you get your period, you become a woman instantly. And as you already know, you can get period between like 13, even a little bit before that as well, around 11 sometimes too, and up to teenage years, whenever. Everyone get it differently. But as soon as you get it, you're basically a woman, for example. For men, I think it's every culture, every country have different standards historically about that. Some were like, if you go and do this act, you will become a man, for example. So there wasn't really an age. It was more about how one became a boy and you become a child to adult immediately. There's no in between. And that's basically what historically it looked like. So this has been going on for centuries, but pedophilia and the word and the research and everything started to be developed in like late 19th century. So there wasn't really a name or anything for it before that. And they usually saw tendencies of, primary attraction to children. They also talked about that it wasn't really a lot of intercourse. It was more about touching and manipulating the child into performing certain acts. But it was more about they found these particular and they started to discover these things in late 19th century. And this also is, as Devante mentioned before, this is also including women. They also did it on homosexual men in this case, but predators can happen to any gender, or predators can happen to, or can be in both. It doesn't matter what gender you are, what sexual interest you have, or a sexual orientation you have. It could happen. Anyone can be a predator, and historically they were touching these issues, but in modern days they kept going with the men and researched on the men predators more. But that's a little bit on the historical part. There's a lot to it as well, so please look it up and research that if you're interested.
I find it interesting how, like, historically at least, like, it seems like as we've gotten more intelligent, developed as a society, as a world, it seems like we've moved past the idea that, like you said, like a man is dictated by his actions. When you're a child, because I remember hearing some of this stuff, like when you're a child, let's say you were in a tribe, for example, I'm just giving an example. Oftentimes what dictated when you became a man was based on your actions. It was rarely due to the physicality of what you could do or how you developed. It was more like, hey,
if you can hunt, for example, you become a man. Or
like if you can provide food, if you can take care of your family, or you help contribute to the house, you are officially a man now. You have crossed that threshold. And in terms of people who can hunt, if we're talking about like, actual, I'm not talking about prehistoric times per se, but, just even between like the 1500s, just if you were part of a tribe that just, some people develop physically more quickly. So as a boy, you could be 12, but then have the body of a linebacker, you're going to hunt a lot easier than someone who hasn't developed physically as much compared to somebody else. And the fact that, that was the metric of you being a man was just like, very black and white, and it's indicative of like our knowledge and understanding of ourselves, compared to, once again, like she said, that women, it was more indicative of their physicality and not actions. It was the second you hit puberty, you can have children.
Yeah, it's like,
and not even just puberty.
It's just like the, it's just instantly, which is sad because everyone get their period or differently, in different times of one's life, and it's still a thing that's going on today. I mean, if everyone, like, if people look back into their grandmas or great grandmoms, or they can see that many of them got their kids very young, and also today it's still a thing, in some countries, and also there are victims who had to have children very early in their life because they got sexually abused as a child, or there's a lot of things that is still going on. But if you look historically, it was more normalized because they didn't really see the difference. The age wasn't really a thing then. It was more like, when are you finished developed from a child to an adult? So it's an interesting thing. I mean, some people, like, it might be, something that we have to consider when we think about modern issues today. So, yeah.
And so, and just historically, I just always find stuff like that, like how things have changed so much. But also, in retrospect to that, it's like, even though things have changed, also how things have stayed the same, how like even past events can like affect even modern culture, like you were kind of touching upon today. Like a lot of that stuff still happens in culture now. Like a lot of that rhetoric is still preached. I'm pretty sure there's plenty of women out there who've heard from their mom or their dad or their grandparents, like, when are you having children? The second you got out of high school, like when you were just 19, 20, they want grandkids.
Too. Like, oof.
Absolutely. Immigrant families, the second you get out of high school, you just barely in your 20s, you can be 20 on the dot and they'll be like, I want grandkids. They put that pressure on you. And that's behavior and rhetoric that's still tied to a lot of the old school and old mentality of having children young, because, you know, for some reason being young, that's
it's
what your duty is, because you're capable
of doing
it.
Or, you know, it's very,
and it's just like this behavior is still, it has survived for so long. And we also, not even just, you know, I think that's more of a subtle way of saying, like, you know, people really want grandchildren at a very young age, and how women are seen as women at young ages, but also how pedophilia has infiltrated, we already know, Hollywood, has infiltrated a lot of influencers, just in general, a lot of, you know, big and rich and wealthy people still participate in huge scandals regarding pedophilia that has creeped into pop culture. And we hear about it damn near every day. You know, every day you hear about somebody getting involved with some sort of child, some sort of, I think we was talking about it off mic, you know, sex islands. And
also, like, in general, in movies and series, in anime, like it's basically, it's like acceptable. And it's only a movie, it's only a series, but that you can see how, it's real, because most of the directors and those involved in those movies or series are interested in children or teenagers. And, you know, an example, iCarly, you know, those Nickelodeon shows.
Dan Schneider. Look, and I hate to say it, like, I'm gonna say this, but he was a sick man. But those shows was slapping.
I hate it too, and that's why he got away with so much. And the actors were uncomfortable. Some of them didn't even realize until they got older. They were like, "Oh wow, this is so weird," you know. And
he's still employed, by the way. He's 2020. He did an interview with a cast of an old show via Zoom. He's still employed, and I'm just like, that's out of control. And then, like, you can, I'm going to talk about this for a second. It's still relevant, but it's just like, when you watch iCarly, like, sure, the show is funny, even Victorious,
it's random, and you
stuff.
think it's random.
It's random. And then there were very specific things, like, I remember one time in the interview, Ariana Grande was saying when she was in Victorious that she could not wear her hair a specific way because he didn't like it for her character as a redhead. Even the way she acted as, like, this, if you've seen Victorious, you know,
she's very
Kat, her character, she's very ditzy, she's very airhead. She's acting like an airhead,
basically.
Yeah. And a lot of those characters, like, was almost like a fetish, because, believe it or not, that does exist. There are a lot of, you know, men and women who like people who are attractive but airheads. I want you to be beautiful but don't have an opinion.
Fetish, and you could tell.
Absolutely.
I didn't understand when I watched those series. I didn't understand that. I was like, oh, okay. But when you think about it, there were a lot of feet scenes.
Yeah,
going
feet
on.
And spaghetti and iCarly with Sam. Like, he just had a thing for it. And I don't want to dive too deep into the iCarly and Nickelodeon thing, because trust me, I could talk about that for an eternity.
I know, me too. But you have to roll on.
Just to prove the point, that this stuff creeps into pop culture, and then kids,
devour
myself
this.
Included, where we devour this. We are
subtle,
raised in this.
Like, you know, it's sad, and you know, it's not until recently they are getting exposed, but they have already done their damage through social media and this accessibility and internet and everything else. And it's sad. And also, another topic that I want to talk about as well is also that usually you want someone to look and act young, and that's a thing in today's society as well. People be like, I want someone who's young, I want someone who's innocent, who doesn't have any experience, which is basically the tendencies of a child, you know, right? But they say like, oh, I want him or her to be 18, just above the age, when they're like, I don't know, around 30 or more. And that's also like, okay, it's not really pedophilia because, as you already know, we told you about the definitions and everything, but it's also like this huge age gaps, and everyone is trying to normalize that as well. And I'm fine with like if both are mentally aware and on the same page, but sometimes I've seen a lot of stories about that too, where they feel like they've been groomed, and also by celebrities as well. Fans or other people have been like groomed into being in a relationship. I've had celebrities that have been waiting for someone to be over 18, and they talked to them when they were like 14, 15. And it's like a lot of things that I think it's like nuances that I also wanted to mention here as well, because I think everything goes hand in hand in like it stems from somewhere as well.
And I will say too, like in conjunction with that, it's like, because you mentioned before, well, literally right before you went into that thought, you were saying like one of the things, it's because of modern technology and the internet, you know, the whole Dan Schneider, you know, the whole Nickelodeon thing, we had access to it. And I think, and this is more my opinion, I think as great as the internet is in terms of information and how it's progressed, you know, how we share and process information with each other, we connect with each other, friends, family, all that jazz, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, whatever you want to call it, whatever platform you fancy in this example or this transitionary thought. It's also tied into the idea of like a lot of those, because I know we was talking about it before, like kind of the whole feet thing, the fetish thing, the pornography thing. So I'll give you an example. So back in like way back, and I mean I remember this because I was in like second or third grade. This was when the internet was fresh. This is dial-up. This is, you can't even be on the phone at the same time as being on a computer, because you know dial-up was hella slow. This was when AOL was popping. This is what You Got Mail. That's when that was popping. So I remember how like the internet was flooded with such crazy and dark sexual things. So I'm obviously trigger warning and well, it's not really graphic because I'm not showing you anything, but I'm describing. So that's when a lot of that stuff with like the 2 girls 1 cup was prevalent online. That was when there were people who was like online posting some of the craziest things you've ever seen on the internet because it was completely unregulated at that time. And I think when the internet came into the picture, when that stuff became accessible, when those types of people who had, either they be a pedophile, a hebephile, whatever you want to call them, in whatever category, when the internet made it so that way everyone had access to each other, had access to these videos, that's when I think things took a turn for the worst when it came to like situations with predators, because those fantasies were shared to millions of people. I had no reason to see that in the 2nd or 3rd grade. I wasn't even home when I saw that. I was in school and I saw that video. So I don't want to say the kid's name because unfortunately I do remember every kid in my 2nd or 3rd grade class's name. But you know, I don't want to, you know, put the person on it because they might recognize me and be like, oh, that's word. But I remember like when someone's like, yo, you want to see something? I was like, all right, cool. You know, I'm a kid. I'm like, I'm not thinking that deep into it. I saw that. I was like, oh no, what is this? And then we was just sitting there and like shocked and awe, burned in our brain, this stuff. And the more prevalent this stuff showed up online, I noticed, like, as I think back on it, I noticed that's when content took more of a turn, like, to a certain direction. And it started to leak into situations like, Nickelodeon, for example, where a lot of those fetishes, I had no idea before that second grade incident. A lot of shows had a lot of those innuendos hidden under the, the surface.
Fact also,
just floating.
It was even before that as well, when it was more acceptable, as so but like nowadays they do it more like they didn't make it look as obvious. Obvious. They make it look very like they putting a small hint there, even cartoons, but they brush it off like adult jokes. But I think there's a difference between adult jokes and like
really sexually explicit
of kids
or
and children.
Yeah. And like I said, we're very much aware that a lot of this stuff has just leaked into every aspect of our culture. But knowing all that, let's move on from this section of discussion. What we, I guess, really need to talk about is the importance, not only the distinctions between them, because she did give definitions, but also just how actually being a pedophile, and I know some people are going to hate this, but actually some instances of being a pedophile is actually a full-blown mental disorder. So it's not necessarily like, it's not always someone just like, I'm choosing to do this. Sometimes it is a super complex subject matter. Even what we're discussing today is going to be simplified.
Today, in research and everything, and arguing, and arguing is a little bit, but they have discussions about what it truly is and how to compare, how to, it's a big topic even today, and they, everyone is saying everything differently, but we try to like make it as understandable as possible. If you are all interested in that, it's just, search it, and hopefully you can also get your opinions about it.
Yeah, we'll have the links and everything, but it's just not all the time is it a constant choice. The same way how the debate between, is being, gay or anything, is it genetic? Is there a social aspect to it? And I tell people the same thing when it comes to the conversation of predators, and I'm not comparing the two, obviously, in terms of, who you date. That's not the point. It's about, the genetic component in terms of, is this something that is genetic or is it a social construct? And the answer to both actually is it can be both. Like there is no black and white answer, because it is a super duper, when it comes to anything related to the sexual, anything sexual regarding human beings, it is a super complex subject matter, because sometimes your fetish can be genetic. That was a thing that was discovered recently too. So the things that you're fetishizing in your head can very much come from a parent. But also sometimes the fetishes can be from social related things you see online, things you want to try, fantasies. So it is not a black and white thing. As we're learning, life is a spectrum. So,
I did see a
black and white are just two opposites.
How a man told his wife about him having interest in children and being a pedophile, but he never acted on it. And his wife knew about it. He had kids and everything. He was living a normal life, but he did find pleasure, I guess, with his wife. But it was sometimes you go to the park and watch children play because to lessen his urges. Sometimes it was very, I had to say it, but I found it very odd. But it's, some things are odd to me. Something is very, like, as because for psychologists and other experts, they say that as long as they don't act on it, they don't have the disorder. Because if you act on it, if you act on your fantasy so you can't control it, that's when you have the actual disorder. So there's like a fine line. You have to distinguish between them. And also what type of interest and what ages and such. And in this case, I would say I'm not an expert or a specialist in that way. I just go with what research that is available today and what is as this latest research that we have today. They, in a general, why it happens is that it usually develops around when you hit puberty, and also they don't really have too much evidence about it, but it could be related to anxieties, low self-esteem, depression, and such things as well. But it's not really like set on stone, but they have theories that it could be based on that, and it starts from that. But as I said, like this is nothing set on stone. This is what they assume, or theories that they have. And treatment to treat this.
Well, I was gonna say, I was gonna piggyback off that. Before
sorry. You can Yep, do that. Do you?
And it's so interesting because, like, before we get to treatment, there are some actual characteristics that apply both to men and women who are predators, in terms of like what gives people clues and like the underlying pedophilic behavior that they display that can indicate whether someone can potentially become a pedophile or maybe they're already fully recognized in terms of their urges, but how to recognize someone who potentially might act on them. And one of the main factors that research displays is that they have impaired motivation and impaired inhibition, which means they have little to no self-control, and their motivation is very skewed, which means, I feel like it's self-explanatory, but at least the inhibition part, I feel like it's self-explanatory for sure, is that they know that they're attracted to a certain particular group of, children. And then because, unfortunately, they have the inability to control themselves, they are far more likely to act on these behaviors because it's an impulsory, like a cognitive disorder. So the people that you see who act out on their urges with children, they typically fit that category where they don't have control, they can't control their urges, they have a cognitive disorder, and sometimes they display some traits of psychopathy, which is basically surrounded by impulse control and its core function in psychopathy. And even to some levels could be some, sociopathic behaviors, but they specify specifically psychopathy. So it's interesting that, you can be classified as someone who, like I said, you can think pedophilic behaviors, be attracted to children, but if you still have self-control, you still are, your thoughts are your thoughts. And I'm not saying what's right or wrong. That is not my opinion to state, but someone who is thinking about it compared to someone who is more likely to act. That's the major difference between someone who's going to pose a problem in the future.
And that's also what I mentioned before, that usually that's why it's important to distinguish between them, because like it's scary to be around someone who have those thoughts and watch porn with child porn, but they might not act on their fantasies, or they have a lower risk of acting on the fantasies as someone who have already acted on it and like have the disorder.
Right.
And I also want to mention that I saw, or I watched a professor regarding this topic, who did mention something interesting, that everyone have a tendency of having interest in children, but some have lower tendencies, some have higher tendencies, and some people acts on their tendencies. So he said that most of us are in the middle, which is interesting to me, because I want it normally to everyone to be on the lower spectrum, but in his case he said that most of us are in the middle of this spectrum, and that in this case if we would have followed modern way of saying like you're a pedophile, then everyone could have been a pedophile in that case. So I thought I just wanted to repeat what he said, that he's basically saying that there's a difference, we have to distinguish between them, and like everyone have a tendency for it, but the important part is who is acting on it and who is not acting on it, basically. And I think it's scary as hell, but you know, that's what he said. He's the professor and stuff. So, and he's basing it, of course, on modern research. So you guys know that. But to the treatment.
But I will also tell people. Yeah. I'll also tell people though as well that even though he's a professor, this is still ongoing research. So none of this stuff is set in stone. So if for some reason you got triggered, like, I don't feel attraction to children, I agree with you. I never looked at a child and was just like,
you know, no,
wow.
Yeah.
It's never crossed my mind. But like I said, this is ongoing research. So we're trying to understand why these things happen. So do not take everything as absolute. I'm pretty sure we all know in school that these are just theories. These are scientific theories. These are in development. They don't have anything set in stone yet.
There's a lot of most evidence things in life. Still, you know, there's not a lot of evidence. They're still researching on the topic. There's so much that needs to be researched on still.
So definitely don't take it too serious. But these are all just foods for thoughts. But yes, let's get into treatments for.
So when it comes to treatment options, yet again, it says that they say basically that there's no real, you know, cure for it. However, you can minimize the urges and also the desires and fantasies and everything by doing cognitive behavioral therapy, also behavioral interventions. And you can also use pharmacological interventions to reduce the sex drive and with different medications and drugs.
Basically chemical castration.
Yeah. So, and they have actually been going pretty well with the therapy parts. It have actually reduced. It does help, but it's not really like a cure. You can't really be free from it. So that's why they, even though it helps, it's still you're not free from it. So, but they were working really great. They have been doing studies about it, how to reduce because sometimes having the tendencies can be based on traumas from like what you have been going through as a child, and you can minimize most of it, and by minimizing the attraction to children and it going towards being attracted to adults, for example, that you use the drive to change it from the child to an adult instead and such things. And it's actually pretty interesting. They also say that, okay, masturbate more and try to suppress the sexual arousal to children by masturbating and try to fantasize and think about adults, and like they're trying to
basically just like if I'm understanding you right, it seems like they're trying to
change the mindset
and associate your urges
something
with
else.
A woman, something else. So basically, kind of, and I say this to human beings as well, we're kind of like dogs. So you can change your association to something if you do it often enough. So just behavior therapy in a sense, That's interesting. Nonetheless, they're encouraging the masturbation.
But as I said, it's not really like a free, it's not really the the true way to cure it. It's just like, for some people it have worked, for some it haven't really. It's have been mixed reviews about it. People have had mixed feelings about it in the research world, but it's the best options that is available right now. So yeah.
Well, I definitely have a theory. I think that the people who are probably more likely to see results, and this is just my theory, so do not pass this off as a fact. My theory is, I think the people who are seeing more success from the masturbation or the behavior therapy of, reassociating their urges with something else, I think those are people who are not like the mental disorder, like kind of pedophilia. I think those, and this is like I said, this is a theory, my theory. I think that those people, their attraction to children was more social based. Like it was more of an environmental thing.
That's why they do the program to typically involve training in self-control, social competence, and empathy, and and try to change the views on sex with children. That's basically what the cognitive behavioral therapy program usually looks like for that part. So it's good
stuff here. But I think we're gonna, not even I think, let me start that part again. We're gonna, I guess, kind of wrap it up here.
Yes.
Because I think a lot of this stuff is just to start the discussion. We're trying to, because we're obviously going to be talking about cases, but there are going to be cases that are going to be coming up that are going to involve pedophilia. And this episode serves as a prerequisite, because I'm going to treat this like your college course. You need this to go into the future episodes to understand the difference when we specify, pedophilia, hebephilia, ephebophilia, and all that stuff. Like knowing the difference between the classifications to understand what is truly someone who is a pedophile,
who have the disorder,
who, like I said,
and those
who has a disorder, and some of those people who are like I just butchered it. Ephobophilia, where basically they're attracted to people who are 15 to 19, who physically, we can admit, 15 to 19. Even myself, I look like a grown man.
That's what I'm saying. They look a certain age, but you can't tell the age really on those who are 15 and
yeah, so they're not really pedophiles in a sense. It's just people they're physically attracted to that exterior, not knowing how old they are. And at least in my opinion, I think most people might sit in that category. I'm not saying and when I mean most people, I'm just people who are attracted.
It doesn't change that, when you're between 15 to 19, you don't have the brain development yet ready and everything. So it's like, and also some teenagers, they lie about their age because they want to be all adult-like. But it's that's another topic. But what I'm trying to say is that even though you don't really know the real, sorry, I got distracted. I lost my train of thought.
I'm so dead. So when I say most people, I refer to how most people feel about pedophilia. They think if you're attracted to someone who's 15 to 19, and I mean the social media classification. Most people feel like, oh my God, she's 15, pedophile. Yeah. I'm like, no, that's not the proper term. The proper term is
you can't be called a pedophile if you don't have the actual disorder. But you can have tendencies, but it's not,
exactly.
It's not enough to watch only child pornography and being interested, so you have to act on the actual, But as we have said it before, it's still, they still discuss about what is what and everything, and the definitions. This is what we have in recent years and from recent research. And it's still a topic that is ongoing, and we will try to also in the future podcasts and episodes that if we're going to talk about these issues, we will make sure that we try to use the right terms and the right diagnosis if they have any. But we will also be like, oh, in my opinion, I think it's like this, but it's more about what we think based on what we have. It's not always it's not always that they give us everything when we look up the cases.
So I guess we'll wrap it up here. And I guess, for a little surprise at the end of the video, the interview that she was talking about regarding the professor, I'll play like a little minute 30 seconds of it in the audio so you can hear some of the parts that we're talking about. And just so, like I said, just to start the discussion. That's all this is. And, just keep this stuff in mind. Keep in mind the traits, the definition. Also, this information could help you save someone else. maybe you recognize someone might display some of these traits, maybe, but also don't go be Batman and be like, hey, I'm going to beat you down because I think you're such and such, so be mindful, just pay attention. The whole point is just to pay attention. Keep your eyes open. And, when you see something, just say something. You ain't got to run down on somebody because, like I said, you're not Batman. You don't got all the details. You're not the world's greatest detective, but it's important to pay attention so that way you might be able to help somebody else one day.
I also think
that's all that matters.
I also think it's okay to be scared, even if they don't have the actual disorder. It's okay to be scared of like someone who's interested in it, because especially if you have kids. So we just want to inform you that these are the differences, but it doesn't change the fact that you can have worries and also be worried about that. So
yes.
It's okay. I'm also worried about it. So I'm surprised after I've been researching myself how there's a difference like this, that there are gray zones, but I guess it's gray zones for everything. But either way.
Exactly. But I want to end it on this very horrifying fact that I'm pretty sure most people know, but something I still want you to use to keep your eyes open. The chances of something happening to anyone in your family, whether it be your children, nephew, nieces, aunt, when it comes to predatory behavior is more likely to come from someone close to the family. Family, friends, family itself, and even sometimes in school. So don't always think it's a stranger. Most times it's someone you know personally.
Easily accessible.
Exactly.
For them.
So on that note, stay safe, pay attention, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, week. And, I know times are hard, but just look out for each other, protect each other, and above all, be kind. Be kind people. And go get some good food. Go vibe. Go get yourself a nice burger.
Fries.
Ooh, Cajun fries.
Yes, I actually was.
And
I was really into fries right now.
And if you got a little extra cash, actually go treat yourself to some seafood, some good seafood. But no, that's just me, because me and some lobster go crazy, so crazy right now. Stop playing, like stop.
Lobster.
So I hope you have a good one and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.
So today we'll be looking at some recent and emerging research on the topic of pedophilia. There's been a lot of research looking at the latent structure of pedophilia, so maybe sitting down might be better. We'll look at some research there, and a lot of research I've been doing is looking at the implications of latent structure, so we'll dig into that a little bit. And I wanted to talk about so-called non-offending pedophiles, but I don't think we'll have time. Half an hour is just not enough time to sort of go through all this stuff, all this good research. So I always like to give a shout out to my wonderful colleagues and collaborators on the research, and this is my wonderful village of colleagues. And a lot of the research that I present have been generously funded by these different organizations. So to get us kind of on the same footing, here are some terms I'll be using just so we're all on the same page. So I'll be talking about pedophilia, hebephilia, pedahebephilia. And typically we make a distinction between pedophilia, which is sexual attraction to pre-pubertal children. And just to give you an age range heuristic, it's typically children 10 years of age or younger. Hebephilia is sexual attraction to early pubescent children, so children who are about generally 10 to 14 years of age. And then I'll use the term pedahebephilia, and that just captures both interests, and I'm not making a distinction there. Teleophilia is the attraction to adults. And to really sort of nail it home, today I'm going to be talking about the sexual attraction, because a lot of us in the media and in society, we conflate pedophilia with sexual offending against children. So I'm clearly going to make the distinction. I'm talking about the sexual attraction and not necessarily the sexual abuse of children, which is acting on the interest. Okay, so let's dive into some latent structural research. So a lot of this research takes a taxometric approach to latent structure. And so the question is, well, let's start off with thinking, why is taxometric research important? basically taxometrics allows us to empirically test latent structure to identify latent structure of psychological or criminological constructs. And that's important because, to sort of think out the implications of that, we need to align our research operationalizations, our theory, and applied practice to what we know about latent structure so that we can do what we want to do better. We do better research, more accurate research, more powerful research. But as well in clinical practice, if we have an empirical understanding of latent structure versus just guessing at it, we can do things like assessing, diagnosing, risk assessment, prognosis and treatment, optimal treatment allocation. All of these things rest on latent structure, and it's good to actually know what it is empirically. So this is sort of like a key piece of the puzzle when we're trying to do research with criminological and psychological constructs. Taxometric analysis is all about identifying taxa. And so we'll just briefly get into it, but a taxon is a category of people. And it's a category that has a boundary that we can identify and has a membership. People either are a member of the taxon or they are not a member of taxon. There's no variation between people. Either you got it or you don't. Whereas latent dimensions, there is a range. Everybody has a little bit of the construct. Some people have a tiny bit of it. Other people have a whole lot of it. A lot of us will be in the middle, but a latent dimension, everybody has some degree of the construct that we're interested in. And with a taxon, the boundary is not arbitrary, meaning it's out there in nature and it's up to sort of, in air quotes, find it. So with pedophilia, there are three main options, or possibilities, I should say, for latent structure. It's a dimension, which means, I'll say this very controversially, that means everybody in the room has some amount of sexual interest in children. That's what a latent dimension means. Some of us will have very little, most of us will have very little, then some people will have quite a bit of the sexual attraction to children. And there are two main possibilities for a taxonic latent structure. One is dichotomous. So there are two taxa. People are pedophiles or they are not pedophiles, and that's it. There's no variation. And then there's a third option, a trichotomous taxonic latent structure, where there are actually three taxa. And I'm kind of burying the lead that, well, what are these three taxa if that's the case? But that's the idea that there are three categories of people in terms of their sexual interest in children. So up until this point, we've really had conceptual or theoretical arguments. Pedophilia is a taxon, pedophilia is a dimension. As well, the DSM takes a certain approach to it. So the question that I like to ask is, well, what does the data say? That's great that these people have opinions, but what ultimately does the data tell us in terms of latent structure? So there's been a wonderful crew of us taxometric analysts out there. And so over the last 8 years, there has been a whole slew of research actually looking at this. So kind of right up until Alex and I are preparing a manuscript right now. So I've just put this up in a tabular form just to make it sort of really clear for us. So the studies have sort of fallen out in this way. Skye Stevens and her colleagues, they found that there's support for dimensional latent structure, and Alex and Andrew found support for dichotomous latent structure, and then myself and colleagues and Alex and I currently we're replicating a three taxa structure of the trichotomous. So bringing this all together, what the data are telling us across that, it seems like pedophilic interest is taxonic, which is interesting in and of itself. So 4 studies, and there were 8 samples across the 4 studies. So it's not just 4 studies, it's actually 8 samples. So it's a pretty sizable number of results saying, it's taxonic. And if you're familiar with the taxometric research, especially in psychology, most constructs are actually dimensional. But it seems like sexuality constructs in particular are more likely to be categorical. So this might go against what the general literature might tell us about psychological constructs, but sexuality seems to be the general exception to this dimensional rule, as it were. And so the question remains, well, how many taxa? Are there 2 taxa? And Andrew's paper and Alex's paper supported 2 taxa, but they actually didn't test for 3 taxa. So taxometric analyses, it's not necessarily the case that it automatically tells you if there's 2 or 3 taxa. You actually have to do another step as the researcher. So these 2 studies, they say 2, but they actually didn't test for 3. So I'm leaning towards there's probably 3 taxa. And one of the reasons why I say that, the paper that Alex and I are preparing right now, that we found support for the 3 taxa, it was a massive sample. It was about 8,800 fellows, great measures of pedophilic interest, and it was a general population sample. So it wasn't a forensic sample, it was just 8,800 dudes who were out there in the community who completed this research. So it's pretty compelling evidence if we were picking up the 3 taxa in the general population. Yeah, maybe this is gonna be better if I bring this out. Yeah, that's better. Okay. So to take that away, we're like, okay, great, there's 3 taxa, whoop-de-doo. Who are these people? So it kind of shakes out how we would expect when we start to characterize these groups. That the largest taxa, the first one, they're non-pedophiles. So these are people who have no sexual interest in children. The middle taxa is it's smaller, but they're non-preferential pedophiles. So they are sexually, it's sort of roughly equal interest in children and adults. And then the third taxa was pretty small, and it was comprised of preferential pedophiles. So these were fellows who were showing much more sexual attraction to children compared to adults. Yeah, I don't know why that's not working. Oh, maybe if I go, I think I figured it out. Yeah, okay. So that's, the main takeaway. Seems like it's 3 taxa. Seems like it sort of shakes out in terms of characterizing. We have non-pedophiles, non-preferential pedophiles, and preferential pedophiles. And I repeat that because that's going to be important where we move to next. So some of the research that I've been doing, and I've been looking at other research that's been previously published, and looking at, okay, well, what are the implications of latent structure for the things that we care about doing, i.e. treating people and assessing risk? So I think one of the main implications that these latent structural taxometric research papers can do is they can directly inform the prediction of sexual recidivism. So the question is, does it matter? Does latent structure improve the prediction of sexual recidivism? And sexual recidivism is reoffending in people who've already committed sexual offenses. So is pedophilia a risk factor, and how does latent structure inform that decision? So one of the things that I've been doing and thinking about is, okay, how can we reevaluate past studies that have looked at the predictive accuracy of pedophilia? And there's a bunch of research that's really taken the dichotomous approach. They've categorized samples of sexual offenders as pedophiles and non-pedophiles. They've gone out in the community and followed that sample over time and seen, well, are the rates of sexual recidivism different between those 2 groups when we group people according to non-pedophilic and pedophilic? And I'll be showing some tables with Cohen's D's, so to help you interpret what comes next. So typically we say a meaningful predictive Cohen's D, an absolute value greater than 0.15, whereas Cohen's D is between 0.15, negative 0.15, that's basically a null result. It's not really that meaningful. And there's how to interpret a positive and negative Cohen's D. And it's also important to think, okay, in the forensic psychological research in terms of risk prediction, most risk factors for sexual recidivism will fall between a Cohen's D of about 0.15 and 0.40. So we're not expecting Cohen's Ds of like 2.5. That's just not going to happen in our area. So that kind of just to cement your interpretation of these Cohen's Ds that are coming up, to sort of think about the magnitudes. So one study that I did, and then looking at a whole bunch of other studies in the area that have grouped people as pedophiles, non-pedophiles, what did they find? Generally speaking, most of the findings are, or I'd say the majority of the findings are in the wrong direction, or they're basically not meaningful. So when we group people in a dichotomous manner, it doesn't seem to help prediction across the board for the most part. Beer's kind of the outlier there, and there are some meaningful findings. So that in and of itself is interesting. And one of the other things I've been doing, and this is kind of an idea I'm working through right now. So this is really emerging. This is kind of like in the back of my brain, emerging research. So hopefully I'll be able to write it up soon enough. And so I went through the past studies, even research that I did, and groups use the trichotomous finding, be like, okay, well, if we go back in the past samples and we say, ooh, this sample is a preferential sample, this sample is a non-preferential, and look at studies that categorize their samples in that manner, what are we finding in terms of the predictive effects? And so these studies down there at the bottom, these studies are comparing recidivism rates between the three taxa, and of course, there's three possible comparisons. I won't run through it because it's kind of a mouthful. But so this is, taking a look, and that's to say, well, what is this trichotomous latent structure helping us improve predictive accuracy? And I think this is sort of one of the key findings across the board, is that you can kind of see that when studies are comparing recidivism rates in non-preferentially pedophilic men, sex offenders, and then non-pedophilic sex offenders, the effects basically fall out. Of course, Beers it shows the predictive effect, but across the board, it's basically a null finding, which is kind of interesting. By having that pedophilic group and then removing the preferential or the exclusive guys, that actually just drops the floor of the predictive effects drops out. So that's kind of telling us that really I would go so far as to say there's basically no evidence to suggest that non-preferential pedophilic interest is a risk factor for sexual reoffending, which is kind of I love that finding. It's pretty interesting in and of itself. And then we look at this preferentially pedophilic group of sexual offenders and compare them to non-pedophilic men. And across the studies, the effects kind of jump. And that's, an aggregate effect of about 0.6, maybe 0.65, 0.7, which is actually quite striking. For those in the know, those predictive effects to have that strong range is kind of surprising. So across all of the studies, yes, it was associated with recidivism, and the magnitude of the effect is larger than most of the known risk factors in the past literature of what we know how strong things predict sexual recidivism. And this, again, I think this is another key comparison, because the next question is, okay, great. Preferential seem to offend at higher rates than non-pedophilic sex offenders, but when you compare the two pedophilic taxa, what happens? And you can see that the rates of reoffending are basically double for the preferentially pedophilic sex offenders. So again, that's kind of a striking finding that kind of reinforces that it's actually the preferentiality of the pedophilic interest that's driving the predictive effect. So the takeaways that I want you to have from this is that preferential pedophilic interest is a risk factor for sexual recidivism, whereas non-preferential pedophilic interest is not a risk factor. And I think in our field, that's, for those in the know, I think that's a little bit of a controversial statement, or it's a significant shift in how we think about pedophilia as a risk factor. But the evidence, to my mind, it's pretty overwhelming. It's not controversial given the data and the evidence that we have. And just wanted to bring up, to sort of really further drive home this point of latent structure, and how it helps us do risk assessment. In a recent study, we compared those three possibilities: dimensional, dichotomous, trichotomous. So we tested that out on the same sample, and trichotomous had the most robust support. Dimensional did well, but the trichotomous latent structure had the most support. So that's kind of a whirlwind through the implications for assessment of latent structure. So another part of the research that I've been doing is asking the question, well, are interventions for pedohemophilic interest, are they effective? Those questions are, well, can we effectively treat individuals who have these sexual interests? And then the more interesting question to me is, well, for whom is treatment effective? Because we can make an assumption that, typically speaking, treatment's not going to be equally efficacious or equally effective for everybody. And there's a long, wonderful, complex, beautiful history of treatment effectiveness studies in this area. And so what I did with my doctoral supervisor, Mark Olver, we did a meta-analysis of past effectiveness studies. And so we focused in on studies that looked at interventions specifically for sexual interest in children. And we looked at studies that used phallometric tests for pedohemophilic interest. And I won't dig into what phallometric testing is, just for the interest of time. But those were sort of our two main criteria. Was it a sample of sexual offenders against children? Did they do an intervention for pedohemophilia? And did they use phallometric tests? So we looked at this really great body of research. And so this is the main table from that paper. And when we grouped treatment studies according to, hey, was this a behavioral treatment? We found that there was, a reasonable reduction, decrease from pre-treatment to post-treatment, sort of like a moderate to large effect in terms of reduction of arousal to children over the course of treatment. Interestingly, there was no effects on, as men went through the intervention, they didn't show an increase in arousal to adults. So we saw a decrease in arousal to children, but we didn't see a corresponding increase in arousal to adults, which I'll come back to. And for pharmacological treatments, so medical interventions, usually some sort of testosterone lowering medication, we found, there was a reasonable moderate to large effect in terms of decreases in interest in children from pre to post treatment. And now, interestingly, comprehensive treatments, which is how a lot of treatment is done in the criminal justice system, where sex offenders come in and they're offered a treatment program that targets a whole bunch of different risk factors: intimacy deficits, healthy sexuality, thinking about your thinking. So a whole bunch of things, as well as trying to help men manage their arousal to children. But what we found was there's basically no effects of these interventions, which is interesting in and of itself, that most treatment as it's done doesn't help. So non-specialist interventions don't help reduce arousal to children. So takeaway is that there's this dodo bird effect, and it comes from Alice in Wonderland. All have won and all must have prizes. So there's really no difference between the effectiveness of behavioral and pharmacological interventions. And we found that we did some I don't want to say statistical boohoo, because it wasn't just statistics, but we were able to do some fancy stats that showed that the treatment effects weren't simply attributable to natural remission or regression to the mean. And that's a really important thing to do in forensic or psychotherapy research, to make sure it's just not, a fake effect. Comprehensive treatments had no evidence for their effective, and no treatment was associated with an increase in arousal to adults, which, for those of you who aren't experts in the area, why that's interesting, because most of the studies and most of the thinking and the theory and what the argument has been is, hey, these guys come into treatment and we can help them increase their arousal to adults. And the data actually don't support that claim. And I've got emails ranging from really nasty to, are you sure you did the analyses right? Based on that finding. So I think that that's kind of ruffled a few feathers. So again, to loop us back to latent structure. And this comes back to the question of, well, for whom is treatment effective? Treatment effective, great. But for whom is it effective? So the question, a more sophisticated way of saying that is, does considering latent structure, does that moderate? Does taxon membership, does it moderate the effect of treatment? And so what we were able to do is we were say, here's this body of literature, all these wonderful studies, and let's categorize the samples. Let's categorize them as either low pedophilic interest, moderate, high pedophilic interest to align with the 3 taxa structure. And we had criteria for the cutoffs based on our taxometric analyses that we used in this. So we said, okay, here are samples that fit in the 3 categories. Then we basically asked, what's the treatment effect? How much change over the course of treatment do these 3 groups of samples show? And this is what we found. And I mean, really, this is what we would expect to find. Sort of as you go from the non or the low pedophilic taxon down to the highly pedophilic taxon, what you see is an increase in the treatment effect. Goes from basically a non-effect to like middling effect to a moderate to large effect. And this is for pedohemophilic interest. And then we looked, when we zeroed in on pedophilic interest, the effects were even more, that trend was even more pronounced. So it seems like group taxon membership was a significant moderator of the effect. So that kind of tells us for whom is treatment effective? Well, it seems like for these folks, treatment is effective, which is kind of a cool finding from this paper. So that answers the question, much higher treatment gains. And what I think is important to mention about this further is that, this is reasons for clinical optimism, which is sexual offenders that come in and are given specialized interventions and they have really high arousal to children. We actually have a lot of reason for optimism that they'll be able to manage their arousal to kids, which is exactly what we would want to see. So I think some people get kind of bogged down in pessimism. Oh my God, they're preferential pedophiles. They're doomed to reoffend. Maybe not. Maybe not. They seem to be able to manage their arousal quite well, which is fantastic. And I think one of the other key takeaways is sort of more on a systems level, is that specialized intervention for sexual attraction to children should be reserved for highly pedophilic sexual offenders. And that might not sound like a really important thing to say, but across a criminal justice system and the population of sexual offenders, the absolute number that are highly pedophilic is going to be very, 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 very small. So this is actually telling us we don't need to be doing specialized intervention for the majority of sexual offenders that come in to the prison system or probation and parole. We should reserve those specialized treatments only for that really specific. And to give you an example, in our paper, in our meta-analysis, I think about 75% of the men, the sex offenders in the samples got treatment that ultimately wasn't helpful. 75%, which is, it's striking. And to me, that's a striking number. And it says that's a complete waste of really important resources and therapy resources. And this is the last point of the talk. I don't want you leaving here thinking, aha, we now have a cure for pedophilia. The research doesn't support that. I don't think we have any evidence to make that sort of claim. But I think this is effectiveness in helping men manage their arousal to children, which in and of itself is pretty important. But we're not turning pedophiles into teleophiles. That's not what this research is supporting. So don't leave here and be like, we have a cure. No, we help men, when they're experiencing arousal in their daily lives, they have the skills and the tools to be like, okay, this is happening. That's fine. I don't need to act on it. I'm not a monster. This doesn't mean I'm going to offend. So I think that that's sort of the conclusion that I want people to walk away. Managing arousal is not changing someone's sexual orientation. And that is it. Bye. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Yeah.